Hey everybody, this is Shecky along with my amazing partner, Mr. Jack Gibson. How you doing, Jack?
Doing great, Shecky. Excited about this podcast today.
Yeah, me too. So the topic of today, which is we're going to take a pretty deep dive, is how to rehab, but not just how to rehab, but rehab with complete confidence. So we're going to be introducing a very, very special guest. So hang on because we're going for a fun ride. Welcome to the High Return Real Estate Show, the podcast for heavy hitters. 2 men, 1 mission. It's time to build your empire. So welcome everybody to the High Return Real Estate Show. And just a little overview of what we're going to cover today, but we are going to introduce you to a very, very special guy, a guy who we've grown to have really a lot of respect for. And when it comes to rehabs, we're going to be covering everything. We're going to be sharing with you a checklist that this gentleman uses. We're going to talk about rehabbing based on property class. We're going to talk about decisions about when to replace something versus when to repair, how to stay up to code, and even some of the bigger decisions like, do you want to take on a total gut job rehab or just stick with some of the cosmetic stuff? So it's going to really, really be an action-packed podcast, and we're very excited to share some really great information with you. And that said, I want to introduce you to an amazing guy named Antonio Hornbeak, who we've been working with for some time. He is a native of Indianapolis. He is a father. He is an athlete. He's got kids who are athletes. He is a fellow investor, and he is also a very seasoned flipper and rehabber, and just comes with an incredible amount of expertise in that area. And we use him for that expertise to manage quality control for us here at High Return Real Estate. So welcome, Antonio. I know you're almost always out in the field, so we're thrilled to have you in the studio.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, no problem. So let's just start with the basics. And what I want to know is, how are you able to get, I know you use a checklist, but how are you able to get this thing so dialed in that you don't have to be so subjective about it?
So the first thing I do is I have basically a 7-point checklist.
Okay.
So I like to stick with this checklist no matter the class of property that I use, and it just it allows me to have the confidence that I'm not overlooking anything. And I know that that's a big thing with a lot of investors, is not falling into any traps. So what I like to do is I have this 7-point checklist that I like to use. Start at number 1, go down to 7. And then what I do is I put a check mark to all the things that are acceptable, and the next to the ones that are not. Go through the complete checklist, and then I see what I have after that.
So in other words, there might be a checklist behind the checklist. Like if you get up to an area, I'm guessing that the 7 are major areas. And if you start seeing that something doesn't pass the test on one of those 7, is there another checklist behind that as far as minor things or smaller items within that to review?
Not really a second checklist, more like a point system. So, there's maybe 2 of the top 3 that I don't want to take on one property. But if it's just one of those issues, then I'll take on. And then a couple of the lesser points are able to accumulate lesser points. So if I've got 3 or 4 of those lesser issues on hand, more willing to take on those issues than the top 2 or 3, because those are going to be your more expensive expenses.
Okay. And do you know off the top of the head what those 7 are?
Absolutely. So the first thing I like to do is I physically just look at the structure. So if you can literally look at it and see if it's leaning or there's a wall that's leaning. We're talking about the exterior of the structure.
Mm-hmm.
So then the second thing I like to look at is the roof and the membrane. So I want to make sure that the roof is intact and it's not allowing any moisture or water inside, and also keeping my heat or cooling from escaping. All right. So then the third thing I like to look at is I like to look at the electrical. Fourth, actually. Third, I like to look at the
plumbing.
No, I hope you're editing this. Third, let's start over. So first, I like to look at the roof and the membrane.
Right.
Okay, so I want to make sure the roof is intact so that I'm not allowing any water into the structure.
Let's do this. Let's take a stop and we'll edit.
Okay.
Okay. Just leave about a couple second pause and I'll come in and re-ask the question.
Okay, I got you.
So, Antonio, do you know off the top of your head what these 7 items are?
Okay, so the 7-point checklist goes as this. So the first thing I like to look at is the structure. So I want to make sure that that the structure is solid, that it's not leaning over or anything like that. So secondly, I like to look at the roof. And I want to make sure the roof is intact, try to judge the age of the roof, and make sure the membrane's intact, and make sure there's no moisture coming into the property. Mm-hmm. So then thirdly, I like to look at the foundation. So I want to make sure that there's not a lot of water coming into the basement, if there's a basement or a crawl. And then I want to check for cracks or bulging of the walls. Mm-hmm. One of the things I like to do is if it's bowing out maybe like an inch, that's kind of normal on a lot of older houses. But if you start seeing bowing of the walls at about 3 or 4 inches, then that's when you've got some structural damage, and that's probably a property that you want to stay away from.
And that's obviously a non-issue for many of the properties that are just on a flat slab. Like I know we're in Indiana, but in other parts of the country, that wouldn't be the same. So just as a finer point, if somebody were looking at a slab, what would be the difference of the way they'd be looking at it versus the kind of property that you're looking at here in Indiana?
So if you're on a slab, you're more looking at the exterior structure of the slab. Obviously, you won't have any walls because in the basement, you have a wall, so you won't be checking for bowing of the walls. So you're just more looking for low spots on the outside where water may be going into your crawl, or cracks on the foundation of the crawl.
Okay, so that was 3.
That was 3. So then fourth, I like to look at the electrical work. Electrical work can be one of your primary expenses in rehabbing. So I like to look at those. I like to look at the age of the light sockets, make sure all the wiring is intact, and then make sure that everything's up to code. Staying up to code is a tough thing to do because they revamp the codes like almost every 6 months. So the thing that I like to do is get with the licensed electrician and make sure that I'm still up to date on the codes that I knew of last time. That way I don't run into any issues in the future.
Okay, cool. So that's 4.
That's 4. So number 5, we want to go to your plumbing, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to check for leaks and your water pressure. Obviously, a lot if you're looking at a house before you've purchased it and it doesn't have electricity or running water, then this is a tough thing for you to try to evaluate. So what you do is you look at the plumbing structure itself and the electrical structure itself. So if you see a lot of bare wiring or sockets pulled out of the walls or hanging plumbing pipes, then you're probably going to have a bunch of electrical or plumbing issues.
Yep. Okay. That's 5, right?
That is 5.
So that's 6 and 7.
So 6 and 7. So 6, I want to look at my mechanicals. I want to look at my furnace and my water heater.
All right.
Try to date it. Usually all furnaces and water heaters have a manufacturing tag with the date on it. So you can know what year it's manufactured. I like to replace them. If they're 20 years old, I like to go ahead and replace all the mechanicals. And then that takes us to number 7, which would be your windows and your doors. And I want to make sure all my windows and doors are operational and check for any gaps or spacing that I might have that's going to allow heating or cooling to exit my house.
So it's interesting. You did not really mention, like walls and trim and flooring and any of those 7, right? Would you say then that those become sub-issues of other problems? Like, in other words, like let's say you had a plumbing leak and, it was dripping through a ceiling and that started messing up sheetrock and that was dripping on the floor and created a stain on the carpet. Yeah. Is that kind of how you're judging it?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I like to look at the roof first. So if there is roof damage, it doesn't automatically negate the property for me, but I'd like to see how much damage it's caused from that roof damage. And same thing with the plumbing. So if there's a plumbing issue and it's been causing water to leak inside of a wall or something like that, so then I want to evaluate the extent of the damage for the water being in the wall, such as dry rotting any wood or any structural things. Drywall in itself is a pretty easy fix, and at the end of the day, it's a fixer-upper. So we're going in with the intent of doing some fixing up.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so it's awesome that you have these 7 points, and I know we're going to get a lot of listeners that say like, hey man, how do I get a hold of this checklist? Because I know a lot of people that listen to this may be driving in their car or whatever. So for the listeners that are out there, stick around, because Antonio is generously willing to share this checklist, and we'll show you a way that you can get this checklist from us at the end of the show. So I want to move on to a couple other things, and I think that the checklist is a great place to start because it kind of gives you a pretty good blanket idea overview of what to do. But there is a whole lot, and we talk to a lot of rehabs, and of course we do a lot of them too, but there's a whole lot of nuances to this. And one of the nuances that we see, especially in our business, is how does this change by property class? Like, so, obviously a C property, you're going to have people that both renters and maybe end users, investors that have a different expectation of a C property than an A or a B class property. So how do you decide things like, when it's worth adding that extra bedroom, or, doing granite versus tile, or Formica? Like, how do you make those decisions?
So a lot of those things are what I would consider luxuries. So let's say, for instance, on a bathroom, if we tiled the shower, that's considered more of a luxury than it would be for functionality of the bathroom. Mm-hmm. So if we're in an A-class neighborhood, B minus, obviously appeal to the property is what people are paying for also. So part of that would be upgrading the bathroom with tile instead of just using a vinyl surround surround, or it could be maybe instead of using hardwood floors, you just use a carpet, something that's cheaper. Yeah. Or like I said, granite versus just maybe using a pre-installed countertop. So.
Right. So, but so in other words, you're saying like, if we use a C-class property as an example, mm-hmm. you're saying that you would never, ever spend the money to tile the bathroom. You would just do a tub surround.
I would do a tub surround. I would never spend for that amount, because you're not going to get the amount in rent for that property. Or if you're reselling the property, you're not going to get that money back for that property in that neighborhood.
All right. So the weird one then becomes the B class property, because it's not an A and it's not a C. So if you had a fairly nice B class property, then is that sort of the dividing line? Like, I've seen some nice tub surrounds. Right. So can you still get away with a tub surround in a B class property, or is that the point where you have to pretty much think like, it's pretty much the expectation that you got to have tiles in the shower?
Well, no, I think you can still get away with it, but you can also do some things like using some tile accents. So you may not tile the entire bathroom, but you can use some tile accents or tile a portion of the bathroom to give that luxury look.
Yeah.
And then also come in with some other things, make sure all your fixtures are new and updated and modern looking. And that kind of adds the appeal to the bathroom also.
Yeah, Antonio, just to interject a question, what kind of difference are you talking, just to kind of give the listeners an idea of the difference of how much you can spend on a bathroom, A class versus C? What are you talking about price-wise there?
So let's use specific items in general. So let's say for vanity. So if we're in a C-class neighborhood, we can get a nice, clean, sturdy-looking vanity for $100. Whereas if you're going into an A-class neighborhood and you want to use something that's a little more luxury-wise, you could spend anywhere from $600 to $1,500 for a vanity. So those are the types of price differences that you'll look, and that's just the vanity alone. So then you go to if you're going to use tiling versus a surround. So depending on what type of tile, I mean, there can be some tile that ranges from anywhere from $1 per square foot all the way up to $4 or $5 a square foot. So all that is still more expensive than just using a surround, shower surround to give yourself a new modern looking bathroom.
It's quite a significant difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, once you get into these luxury items, you're also talking about more labor. It's more labor to tile a shower than it is to just add a surround. So not only are you paying more for the materials, you're also paying more in labor.
Yeah.
Excellent.
What's your thoughts about the extra bedroom? Because we know, like, especially from a standpoint of a buy and hold, let's say, and somebody wanting to have an extra bedroom to rent, right? There comes a point where it obviously is feasible to do that versus times when it's not. But I've also seen some extra bedrooms that have been added to properties where it just looks so disjointed, like it's not they put an extra wall in where it really shouldn't have been there. And,
right.
So I'm kind of curious as to what your thoughts are. Like, when does it make sense to do that? And I also know that, one of the sub conversations about this is, at least in Indiana and many other states, a bedroom's not considered a bedroom unless it has a closet. So there's that issue to address as well too. So what are your thoughts on that?
So like I would suggest, if the structure is already set for a bath or for a bedroom, and you can easily convert it, meaning, so here in Indiana, we have these duplexes, and so it's basically just like a shotgun house. You go in the front and everything is headed straight to the back. So you've got your living room, then you may have a bedroom, then a dining room, then a kitchen. So this dining room, while it has the 4-wall structure and an entry, you could also build a closet into that room and then call it a bedroom. So it goes from a 1-bedroom, 1-bath to a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. And also that helps on the resale of the property. So if all I had to do was build a closet to make an extra bedroom, all of a sudden you're building an extra bedroom for a few $100, the cost of building a closet.
Okay. And that you'd probably recoup, even if it was buy and hold, you'd recoup that in rent too. Because, you mentioned that it would improve the resale value, but I want the buy and hold listeners also to appreciate what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of, I'm trying to figure out, what's the dividing line.
So maybe a 1-bedroom would go for $500, where if I added on a closet to that one room, now I have 2 bedrooms, and all of a sudden I can get $650 because I've added a second bedroom. So it all comes down to the cost. So if you're adding an extra bedroom for a few $100 and the return for that is an extra $150 in rent, then I'd say that's a good thing.
Yeah, because you're recouping it pretty quickly.
You're recouping it really fast.
Awesome. Okay. And then what's your thoughts? Like I'm a big fan of granite, so I'm wondering, and it's becoming much more prevalent, and I think the costs of granite are really coming down. So like, what's the right? I mean, do you ever see granite in C properties? Is that anything to be considered, or?
I would say no, and if you do, it's very rare. It would be in an instance where maybe an investor or a home rehabber has just gotten ahead of themselves and have just overspent on rehabbing the home.
Yeah.
And that's just not money that you'll ever recoup in a C-class neighborhood.
Okay. And that sort of leads me to the one that I always am curious about, especially in the kitchen, is the flooring. Mm-hmm. Because from what I've seen, when you put in a ceramic tile, they tend to last a very, very long time. Like, they don't necessarily wear out. And if you get one that cracks or something, it's pretty easy to replace.
Yes.
As opposed to vinyl, which can sometimes tear, you spill some boiling water on it and it bubbles up, and now you've got to almost replace the whole thing, and it shows wear and tear a lot faster than ceramic tile, let's just say. So I know maybe a little bit more to put in the ceramic tile, but is it worth that extra expense in, let's say, a C-class property?
So this is one of the nuances of rehabbing, and each property is always going to be different, So let's say you have had the property for, I don't know, a couple of years, and you've seen the wear and tear that the property is getting. So you can go in with the kitchen and you can put in ceramic flooring, and then you can just kind of judge from your other from your tenants or from the turnovers what type of wear and tear they're putting on there. So it's almost like a trial and error type of thing. But if I had to give anyone advice, I would always say, if you're in a C-class neighborhood, then go ahead and go with the cheapest route, but make sure that you're not going the absolute cheapest route to where you're dealing with redoing the cheap route every time you turn a tenant. So what I mean by that is, I may not go with the most expensive flooring, but I may not also go with the most inexpensive flooring. But if I'm in a C-class neighborhood where the turnover is high, I'm just not going to put a lot of money into my bathrooms and my kitchens as far as cosmetic and visual looks. I'm going to consistently stay on the infrastructure of the property.
Okay. So it sounds to me like, if I'm reading between the lines, that there is there's good vinyl and bad vinyl.
There's good vinyl, there's bad vinyl, there's good tenants, and there's bad tenants.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
So, like I said, you can get a really cheap vinyl that even if the tenant is just halfway decent on your property, here in another year, that's just the material. It's just going to start getting rips and tears, especially if they have children that are dragging toys or other sharp objects they can catch onto it. So you may think of it as only a couple of $100 expense now, but you're going to be having that same couple $100 expense here another year or two down the line.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. And then did you have any stories of, to use a sporting term, let's just say over under? And I know, Jack, you've got probably some opinions on this too, but have you run into situations where you've underspent for the property class and it's come back to bite you, or you've overspent for that property class and it's come back to bite you?
I guess a prime example of underspending would be, so with some of the mechanicals of the house, I try to not spend so much money on, and we would go in and not add garbage disposals. So what happens with that, especially in C-class neighborhoods, it's just the nature of the beast. People are going to put things down their drains, whether it be grease, food, things that they're not supposed to.
Yeah.
And inevitably, the drains are going to get clogged, especially if it happens over time, more grease and wear and tear they put on your sink. So in the beginning, I was not putting garbage disposals in because I just didn't want that expense, even though they're $80 to $100. But what I found is when we're going in to turn the properties, we were always having drain issues, and I would have to spend the money to snake the drains quite often. So that's one of the stories I have about underspending. Overspending would have to have been probably the first property that I ever turned. And, everybody's excited about their first property and you want it to look spectacular. And I just went in and overspent on everything. I made the bathroom look really nice. I made the kitchen look really nice. And I was only getting $600 rent. Yeah. Nobody coming in to rent that home rented it because of the kitchen and the bathroom.
They rented it because it was $600.
They rented it because they could afford it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. That's as a renter, that's the kind of property you want to find.
Absolutely.
You get more bang for your buck. But, you bring up, it's a good segue because you bring up an interesting concept about being emotionally involved in the repair/rehab process, right? And, and I'm like you, it's a reflection of me. I mean, I want it to be nice, look nice, whatever. I'm not even necessarily thinking about the renter. I'm thinking about, this is kind of my art, my piece of work. Absolutely. Right? And so, as business people, we have to learn how to remove that emotion from it, right? So how do you get out of this situation where it's subjective, right? Because that's a pretty subjective view. How do you standardize decisions? So almost to kind of loop back around to your original checklist and some of the earlier part of this conversation is, how do you determine, when you replace or when you repair, right? How do you get out of your own head and your own way and just go, okay, look, this is pretty black and white. If it's X, I'm going to replace it. If it's Y, I'm going to repair it. So how do you do that? Let's say I want to ask more about the bigger things like roof and mechanical. So right. Where's the cutoff line?
So again, it would be kind of property to property, neighborhood class to neighborhood class. I would say that the number one thing would be experience. And that's just something that a lot of first or second time investors don't have. So I have the experience of replacing things that I probably shouldn't have. I should have just repaired. And I've had the experience of repairing things that I should have just replaced. Yeah. So it's an experience thing with me now. And I just know going into it, hey, I've had the experience of doing it this way before and it didn't work out for me. Yeah. Well, there's a reason why there's that cliche that experience is the best teacher. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. For sure. So you would say that's true of windows and foundation and all big items. Is there any tips that you could give the listeners, drawing on your experience, like for example, foundation, you sort of started saying on it,
like as an example, you get to in a basement 3 or 4 inches of bulge. Is that where you just say, okay, I'm done. This is not a property I want to buy and rehab?
I would say that's not a property I want to buy and rehab. Absolutely.
Okay, so there's a situation where you could say black and white. So let's talk about mechanicals. Would there be anything from a mechanical that would say, I just don't want this property at all because both the furnace and the hot water heater are both bad? Would that turn you away from buying a property?
That would not turn me away from buying a property because, for one, we're probably buying an older property anyways.
Right.
And that's just something forward thinking that you're not going to want an expense in that area anyhow. So you're coming in with a fixer-upper. You want to kind of stick to investing your money in the primary steps of the property: the foundation, the roof, the mechanicals, the plumbing, the electrical. As long as those things are intact with your property, you always have a solid property.
So have you ever looked at a property that flat out had a hole in the roof?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So here's the question: would that keep you away? Would that be the kind of thing that just you would say, no, I'm done? Or would you then say, well, we know we've got a big expense on the roof. Can we still make the numbers work and cover that expense?
So the first thing I would do would assess the damage from there being a hole in the roof.
Yeah. So
because the expense also becomes not only repairing a new roof, repairing the damage that not having a roof has caused. So if I go in and I've got to replace a lot of walls and framing in the house also with the roof, then it becomes a thing of how much am I paying for the property? What am I going to get on the return of the property?
Yeah.
Typically, things that keep me away from the property are problems with the foundation or problems with the roof and other points on the 7-point checklist that are not comprehensive with what I'm trying to get done with the property. So if I've got electrical issues and I've got a roof issue,
it's starting to get expensive.
It's starting to get expensive. If I've got a bunch of cosmetic issues and a roof issue, that can still be a good property.
Okay. Antonio, what about fire damage on the property? How do you evaluate that? Do you kind of stay away from those, or what's your thoughts?
Well, so you kind of assess the amount of house of structure that's been burned or damaged. So, if you've only got to rebuild maybe a room, that's not a bad property. You usually typically get deals on burnout properties that in that manner, and you don't have to rebuild the whole structure. Now, if you've got to go in and probably pretty much reframe the entire structure, and roof and electrical and plumbing, then that becomes a pretty expensive tab, and that's probably almost like just building a new house.
Right.
So you alluded to this earlier about staying within code. I think you mentioned on the electrical, you would bring in an electrician and, make sure that that person was looking at the current electrical system in relation to what the current code is, no matter when that code changed. But how do you do that for everything? Because there's codes beyond electrical, right? There's plumbing and, there's a whole bunch of other codes. So how do you ensure that you can easily stay within the letter of the law, without having it be this whole big aggravation with government officials and all this stuff? Like, what's your magic for that?
So the number one thing is relationships with other professionals, as far as my plumbers and my electricians and my contractors. But in this day of information, the city has a website and they have to document all their code changes and coding for you. So if there's something that you're not quite sure about, then you can always log onto your city's website and look at the codes there. Honestly, they change codes like maybe almost every 6 months. So it's not something that the average person or even the average investor or flipper is going to be able to keep up on. So again, especially dealing with electrical issues and infrastructure issues, I always contact a professional to let me know if the codes have changed from the last time I've done an electrical job.
Okay. And have you ever run into like code violations? And if so, how do you deal with those?
Yeah. So what usually happens with code violations, if the city is giving you a violation, they'll usually just write you a ticket. A lot of times they give you an opportunity to rectify the situation. And so once you do that, then you just show proof that you've remedied it, and you don't have to pay a fine. if you're doing an inspection, then the inspector usually will pick up on the code violation before the city does, and that way you have a chance to fix it also.
Okay, but it's, the way you're pretty easygoing guy, and
right.
Aside from that, I know that's something that's very easy for rehabbers to flip out over. You're saying it's really not that big of a deal as long as you're addressing it?
It's not that big of a deal as long as you're addressing the issue. Again, these rules aren't put in place to get honest homeowners and renters from doing business. It's to keep the bad people out. So as long as you're keeping up to code and you're on top of the property, they're not going to come and gouge you for a bunch of money unless you're just not taking care of the issues.
Okay. All right. So as long as you're acting responsibly, it should be okay. And, Jack, you asked a great question, and this kind of leads me to kind of the bigger version of that next question is, you talked about fire damage and, getting to a point like where you're taking something down to the studs,
yeah.
right? So here's the part that always kind of gets me on this decision part. And it's like, I know it's kind of driven by making the numbers work, but when you do like as a person who, almost all of my stuff is buy and hold, right? So to an extent, as that kind of an investor, I'm drawn to the total gut jobs, right? Yes. So it's a love-hate relationship, right? Like I love them because I know things are going down to the studs. I know that all the plumbing is new. I know that even maybe some of the framing is new. I know the roof is new. I know the plumbing is new. So from a standpoint of longevity of that property continuing to produce rent for me and not, decreasing the likelihood of future repairs, that's what I love about it, right? What I hate about it is all the work and money and time that has to go into doing a total gut job, right? So on the other side, there's the more just the ones that just need some cosmetics. Like everything seems to be fine and working, like you got good mechanicals, the heat's blowing hot and the windows all seem to work and the foundation is straight and, it needs some paint, it needs some carpeting, maybe it needs a little bit better vinyl in the kitchen, but it could be done very quickly and very easily and for not much money and get a renter in there quickly and producing income quickly. So I'm really torn as to what to buy as an investor. And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this show that are going, yeah, like that makes a lot of sense because time is money.
Absolutely.
So what's the right answer there?
So, I think there probably is no right answer. So I'm sure there's been success with total guts on burnouts, and I'm sure there's been some failures at it. With my experience, if I'm dealing with a C-class neighborhood and it's a complete burnout,
mm-hmm.
the only way that I would consider rebuilding the home, if it's a complete burnout almost, is the first thing I'm going to do is judge it by the other properties in the neighborhood. Okay, so obviously, if I'm rebuilding the house it's all the way down to the studs. Like you said, I'm incurring electrical fees, plumbing, framing. And then you're going to have to do roof, cosmetics, paint, all those things. So the price starts to get up there. So then you have to think, okay, so am I going to get my money back fast enough with the rent? Well, what can I charge for rent in this neighborhood? So if I'm only getting $550 a month, that's just not enough for me to want to incur those types of repairs. If it's in a neighborhood and I'm getting, $800-900, well, then I'll start to think about it then.
Okay. So in essence, it's really just driven by the numbers.
Driven by the numbers. And like I said, hey, I'm not saying you can't have success with it because obviously you can, but that's just, I kind of like to play the numbers, and the numbers say that stay away from those.
But it seems to me, though, with your checklist, that it's going to handle any situation.
It definitely handle any situation. But I think the purpose of my checklist would be to not fall into a monetary trap. Like I said, we're wanting to flip the home or rehab it and hold on to it. And part of that is keeping our costs down. And so I could, again, if it's the checklist and I've got two of the top three things on my checklist that I've got to do, that's a property that I'm stepping away from anyhow. So you got to think with the burnout, automatically you have 4 or 5 of the top 7, if not all 7 issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. It's sort of like playing bingo. It's like, oh, there they are all the way across in the line.
Absolutely.
So super valuable. Jack, do you have anything that I maybe didn't ask that you want to ask?
Well, maybe a comment and then maybe, another discussion point is, the cost of money, the cost of carrying capital. You have to really analyze when you're taking on a full gut job. You're going to tie up a construction crew for multiple weeks, and you're going to tie up your money. So you've got to get that property at a really serious discount when you buy it. If you're going to take on, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, full on gut job. And so that's always a tough call. And I don't know, Antonio, we've steered clear on a lot of these full on gut jobs just because there seem to be a lot of unknowns, and we could run into more expense than, what we really would like to put in. And then now you're caught because, we have this model where we want to get the highest ROI possible. We're not attached to any particular property. We're looking at purely at the ROI. So that's that's the challenge. And that's why, Antonio, how many properties have we passed on in the last, 2 months? You've scoped out a lot of properties that just didn't fit the bill as far as the purchase price.
Absolutely. And I would say, unless you're getting a property at around $5,000-6,000, going in doing a complete rehab, you're running the risk of putting yourself behind the 8 ball there.
Yeah, for sure. You're talking, you could be up to 40,000, 50,000 easy, and that's with a really well-priced construction team. So those are really something for probably a newbie. I would tend to say you probably want to steer away from. Try to pick the low-hanging fruit. And even with Antonio on my side here, we definitely try to avoid a lot of those full-on gut jobs. And just there's so much low-hanging fruit. If you just keep searching and looking and be patient and put in offers, and you can find really, really great deals that don't need a whole lot of turn as far as the rehab goes. We picked up 2 or 3 just in the last couple of weeks, Antonio, that Oxford, for example, needed maybe 2,000-3,000 or
close to it, maybe just under that, and that was just because I think the property was in such good shape that we just decided to just update it a little bit. And there's a lot of properties out there like that. Like I said, I don't necessarily think you have to take the chance on taking on full gut rehabs right now. It's just there's a lot of properties out there that suggest you don't have to.
Yeah. Now the one kind of like disclaimer there on that advice is, if you really know what you're doing and you've got experience, you can really get some amazing ROI on those big gut jobs. You can get some steep discounts and create a huge amount of value add and create basically you'll have a brand new property that won't have any CapEx expenses for years to come. So there are situations where it's definitely, green light it and go for it. But I don't know, for a newbie, it seems like they could get into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that you have to be really efficient on your rehab. If you're a do-it-yourselfer and you're contracting a lot of it out, and it could get pretty expensive, but if you've got a lot of the work that you can do yourself, then obviously it starts to work out in your favor a little more.
Yeah. So one final comment, I've definitely learned a lot on this podcast. Antonio and I probably talk every single day, and, it's interesting how much I just picked up just from, listening here. So this was fantastic for me. I'm sure for the listener. And the one overwhelming thought that really occurs to me is that I am just very thankful that Antonio is on our team, because I really, this is not my lane. Like I wasn't blessed with the skill set or the vision or the ability to be able to, have any interest or desire in rehabbing or looking at a property and trying to figure out what it needs, or running, a construction team or overseeing it. So as investors out there, you guys got to kind of think about that yourself. Is that really your lane? Like, is that what, you were, put here to do? And if it's not, then, you just got to be smart enough to find a good, person like Antonio, where you can have and tap into and leverage off other people's, skill sets. And so that's always my advice, stay in your lane, What are you good at? And just focus on that. And then, be smart enough to put smart people around you.
Yeah, well said, Jack. And I'm going to put my 2 cents in too, because as you guys know, maybe not all the listeners know, but my history is I did quite a bit of flipping back in the pre-2008, 2009 days. And a lot of my flipping was down in Texas. And, when I look back on it, like, I don't really want to be involved in that part of it. Like, to use your words, Jack, it's just not my lane. And I had a lot of fun doing it. I even lived in some of the properties that I did. But when I look back on it, I was always way too damn emotional about it. Like, it's just like, man, those tiles just don't look good. We got to get a different color. And I was just so, attached to outcomes of the way it looked and not putting in based on property class. And just a lot of dumb stuff that I did. And I don't want to do that again. And
that's the danger, Shecky, is I think for a lot of investors is taking the property from the approach as if you were going to live in that property. And, let's face it, like most of the investors that are going to buy properties to then rent out, in all likelihood, they're living in A-class property. They're probably, a lot of our listeners are in A-plus type properties, So we have got to remove that, as you said, the emotional component of, how would my family like this? Would I live in this property if it were in this condition? What would I want? So that is a huge, I think, danger curve right there that people have got to avoid. And that does come with a certain level of experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to throw in one other minor disclaimer in that, when we start talking about buying properties for, $5,000 and rehabbing for 40 or 50 or 60K, the big disclaimer there is, recognize, listeners, we're using Indiana numbers. So, you may not experience, I can assure you will not experience those same numbers in California or other parts of the country. So, there's some things that are kind of unique to the area that we're in that cannot be experienced elsewhere. But you still, again, you can still glean from the amazing information that Antonio shared today, conceptually, how things would work in your area as well. So just, please take that into consideration. I don't want to, I don't want to have to field a call or an email from somebody going, well, I can't buy a burned out property in Los Angeles for $5K. What the heck are you guys talking about? Well, it's because you're in LA. So we just want to be clear about that. And
or most other parts of the country.
Most other parts of the country. There's still a few left. We're very few where you can do what we do here in Indiana. And if you're in one of those areas, fantastic. And if you're not, well, come and visit. But I want to, Antonio, just really say thank you so much. I mean, Jack and I rely on you a lot, and I want to thank you, not only for the service that you provide to our organization, but just for coming on and sharing all your expertise with us and, making yourself available to our listenership. And so we appreciate that. And I know, on a second layer, that our investors really appreciate the expertise you bring to the properties that they ultimately end up purchasing. So thank you so much for being here.
No problem. You're welcome, and appreciate you guys having me on. It's a pleasure to be a part of the team.
Yeah, awesome. And so if you got value, if you're listening to this podcast and you got value, please, leave us a 5-star review. And earlier we promised we would show you how to get Antonio's magic 7-point checklist. So I know you're going to make this available. Very kind of you to do that to our listeners. And if you want to be able to see and download a copy of it, just simply go to our website, highreturnrealestate.com. It's spelled just like it sounds. And just click on the podcast tab and look for this particular podcast. And we will make sure to place a link to Antonio's checklist inside the show notes. So I know, Jack, you've got, you're working on the next episode, and what you got, man?
Well, I'm like very, very excited because this is definitely my favorite subject and probably a lot of our listeners, which is money.
Oh, yeah.
So, we always have questions about how to finance properties, how to come up with the funds to be able to, purchase properties and build a portfolio, and what are some ways we can get creative, and, all the ins and outs. So next episode, we're going to talk about the top 6 ways that we've found to fund and finance your properties. So do not miss the next episode. We will see you there.
Awesome. Well, very good. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thanks again, Antonio. Thanks, Jack. Always appreciate you, and you all have a great day.